and now we turn from someone being up late at night to someone getting up very early in the morning. That is from Berkeley. So we go to Adam Anderson from Berkeley, who was previously, he was lecturer in digital humanities and data science, and an academic coordinator for digital humanities at Berkeley. So Adam, you're going to be talking to us about data-driven modeling, building data models, right? Over to you.
Yes, that's right. Let's see, I'll share my screen here. Can you see, everyone can see that, I hope?
Yes.
Great, well, as Emily Paget-Perron spoke yesterday about the incredible resources that Cuneiform have online currently with a number of different databases, and especially the CDLI. I know that these databases are the envy of most scholars because they've been indexed to such a degree. But interestingly, they all began in the 1990s. So you're not too far behind. The 90s is still in our relatively close past. So I want to talk today, not necessarily about the intricacies of those databases, but rather what one can do when such databases exist for texts like this. And in kind of creating both like linked data models, but also models that can be derived from that data that are for independent research questions that can be useful for a number of different reasons that I'll illustrate today. So cuneiform data is inherently multidimensional. We're beginning with the curvature of the surface, signs that are impressed into the clay rather than written with ink on top of a flat two-dimensional surface. So there's a lot of dimensionality just in the modality of writing. And there's a lot of effort going into this right now in terms of 3D imaging and working with the dimensionality of the signs for recognition purposes. But one of the interesting kind of conundrums that we find ourselves in sometimes is that even though there's only one of each of these, every one of these tablets, even though there's 500,000 of them, each one is unique, we find that there are sometimes multiple databases with multiple IDs for the same tablet, or multiple sets of metadata for each tablet. So even though each manuscript is, or document, a tablet in this case is unique and uniquely valuable to the scholars, it's sometimes difficult to find all of the different places in which the data is recorded. But in terms of the multimodality, you can see there's, for every sign on this tablet, there's, depth and details that indicate, the nuances of the scribal hand and things like this that are really interesting for philological work. And not everyone knows this, but the majority of the signs, at least, have been given Unicode encodings. This happened in a kind of haphazard way, but at least they're there. The encodings are there. We just have to work on leveraging these. And in fact, some projects are doing this. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the near future, there was a kind of translation page from a transliterated script to the sign form. But that is perhaps forthcoming. Each of these signs, of course, as I'm sure Mark knows, have dialectal variants and discrepancies among scholars about how the signs are even read. And so these, illustrate the usages of the signs at a given time, because there's about 4,000 years of written history for cuneiform. And that as well can be leveraged for a number of purposes. Dating, for example, dating a tablet can be helpful to see if well, let me go back really quick. For the tablet here, there's an old Assyrian tablet, and the old Assyrian period, they were only using about 138 signs. So when we go and look at the full repertoire that comes from the Neo-Assyrian period, and we find the sign is used then, and we would know that it wouldn't have been referring, it wouldn't be an old Assyrian tablet, for example. So here is an example of what the what ORAC, one of the online databases, looks like for a given tablet from the Ur-3 period. And you can see again, like the attention to detail is encoded now into the actual text that we see on the page. So every tablet is linked, and we have a CDLI number here. We also have this link to the BDTNS, Manolo Molina's database. So there is some linking between the databases through this persistent ID. But some databases do it a little differently. In this case, every sign on the tablet is indexed in a lexicon. So that's called lemmatization. This is a really important step, and one that's, of course, not a trivial task at all. But certainly worth the effort to index every character or at least every word on a manuscript, because when this is done, these lexical entries can be given certain typologies that are very useful for additional subsequent kind of research. So in this case, we see that this is, a simple receipt, almost like a 7-Eleven receipt of a goat that has died. And we can see the individual who received this. This is the name of someone we know. There are at least 2 people during this time that had this name, Ludingara. And Ur Ningar is he's the one who sent this, and he's the one who received it. So the source and the target here in terms of a little network. Then we get the month and the year name. So each of these are dated very often to the month, if not the day in which this transaction took place. And these are incredible details, but of course, as you read them as a scholar closely, it's not necessarily these are called boring texts by most scholars. The Ur-3 period is not known for gripping literature. It's known for these administrative, sometimes royal archives that record minute little transactions. And so this is where leveraging a database of these types of texts become really interesting. But of course, to do that, we have to consider not just one database, but all of these. Let's see. Okay, so here's the CDLI's version of this, and you can see that there's additional metadata in the CDLI for the exact same text. We also have a tablet image here for, which the CDLI has been really good about sharing all these images. It's an incredible resource. And you can see there are others. There's, just a plethora of databases for Assyriology, which, we're very lucky to have. So with that information, I have, along with Nick Feldhaus at Berkeley, we've been working on building data models that take in these minute transactions along with the encoded properties of each entity. For example, the role that they're playing in a given text, the professions that are sometimes accompanying a name, the family names, these types of attributes of each entity, in order to link together these minute little microtransactions into a holistic data model. And in doing so, focusing just on one of the smaller archives of the Ur-3 period, we can very quickly assemble an incredible data model, or at least multiple types of data models that are linked and connected. So here we're actually seeing 2 data models linked to each other. One, the red, which is a count of each unique name. And these names were normalized for this purpose. You can see here that Abba Saga has the most instances of a name on a tablet. Now these we assume are actually referring to the same person, because there doesn't seem to be too many different Abashagas. But for someone, like I said, or who we read earlier in the text, this individual, Ur-Ningar, there were certainly a couple of these, if not a few. And so the question, of course, becomes how many of these name instances refer to the same person? And that is prosopographical work. Prosopographies are made of this. And of course, in order to answer that properly, we need some clear methodology to do so. So it's another non-trivial task, and it's one that doesn't necessarily have a gold standard. We usually rely on senior scholars to determine a prosopography and not some computational method. But the idea here is that by coming up with a reproducible method, one that's transparent and can be criticized, that we can kind of understand what goes on behind the scenes when we say that these 3,000 instances of Abashaga correspond to a single node in a network, or not, and leaving that available for scholars to debate. So the blue network here is then this merged network of these instances where we're supposing a person. And of course, that's a dangerous process, one that requires a lot of discussion. So we see, for example, Ur-Ningar, as I mentioned, and who we read in that very first text, we have a lot of metadata that we can pull in from this person. For example, the role that they're playing in each one of these texts, the profession that they're given, the archive that they're associated with. These archives is something I'll talk about later. Family names are really sparse in the Ur-3 period. And you can see additional information like the date. We come up with a way of processing a year name into an integer value so that we can measure these things in time series data. So going then to disambiguation, as you see here, we have a delineation of the same individual who we've been able to, or sorry, not the same person, the same name that we've been able to tease into multiple different people. And this is, of course, referring to the Old Assyrian period. I've done this for the Old Assyrian period and for the Ur-3 period now, to some degree at least. And this illustrates the task at hand, that we have a lot of overlap here between these, at least these 4 individuals with the same name. And determining who's who is, at least at this point, a matter of leveraging all the available metadata, the different fields that would include professions and family names and dates, as well as the commodities that we're counting for the Ur-3 period, and the geographic locations and institutional names and things like that, as well as any kind of archival hints that we can get. And so, these are all factors that boil down to an indexed word in a lexicon. So we use the lemmatization to our advantage in order to hone in on the additional features of each entity that we're trying to disambiguate. And with that, we can take a look at really interesting features of the text at a holistic view. So this is again the Draham archive, Royal and Administrative Archive, one that corresponds to about 50,000 name instances. So and we're in the process of disambiguation now, but we've had some time to focus in on, say, even a single archive like the treasure texts, and look at what that network looks like in a disambiguated model. So going from 500 name instances that we see here to 302 entities that we are suggesting could be the real person recorded. You can see here in this when we do a network like this, that we're able to view really interesting dimensions of their interactions based on centrality, who's receiving commodities and sending commodities most frequently, and it tells us a lot. In fact, a lot more than individual readings of each tablet. A close reading can tell us. And especially for newcomers in the field, this is a wonderful way of familiarizing themselves with the main actors of a corpus. We've also been able to, with the time series data, oops, sorry. I don't know if this is going to play for me. No, it's not wanting to, sorry. But at least you can see that there's a slider here so that we can put this network into a time slider so that we could focus in on any slice of this thing. Let's see if this will work now. We can focus in on any slice of this thing within the time period in which the texts are attested, and look at the beginnings of the network, the kind of culmination of it during Shulgi and Amarsin's years, and then the kind of end of it during the reign of Ibisin. So that these methods, even if the texts aren't dated, using these kind of features can help provide a range of time in which a text or document or person named in there may exist. We can also use these models comparatively and geographically, looking at where these documents are taking place and these instances of transactions or letters being written back and forth, or where the literature is being penned, if that's the case, depending on the text typology. But I think for the comparative purposes, that's some of the most exciting. Very few scholars in Assyriology have actually compared these two archives. And in fact, there are some family names that persist from the Ur III period into the Old Assyrian period. Interesting. Working on that now. But you can see that by getting a big picture of what's happening, that is actually possible. And so these geographic networks, archival networks, looking at how private archives are divided and what is found in the recesses of between known archives are sometimes unknown archives. Here in white, we see an archive of Pushuken, one of the important actors in the Old Assyrian period. We can focus in on just the main players in what's called a co-mention network. And we can look at kinship networks and reconstruct family trees much more systematically. And ultimately looking at ego networks, focusing on each individual. Now, this one was for me most impressive because we've gone from this huge macro view, of like, every tablet that's ever been written in the Old Assyrian period, down into a single individual. And in this case, it's a second wife or handmaid, as it's very often translated, of this kind of middleman merchant, Ashurnada, Shishach Shushar, clearly local in Kanesh, and a woman who would otherwise not have made any historical contribution, and yet now through the accumulation of these one-off instances of her, we can actually see that she was someone really critical in terms of the administration of the household in Kanesh while her husband was away doing his foreign trade offshore and abroad. So what we can end up with is something that would otherwise have eluded us from a single one-off reading in the aggregation of all of this data. And I think that this provides avenues of research that we really haven't explored yet. And that is what happens on the fringes or with these lesser known entities, lesser known words ultimately in a database. So this is ongoing work that's happening with largely in Python, Jupyter notebooks, where we are working discretely and not, with a kind of, these tools are happening outside of the database, but they're certainly populating or repopulating the data, repurposing the databases that we're using with the intention of linking all of these different databases into a more discoverable place online as well. So thank you so much. I think that's all. My time is up, but I'll go ahead and stop there.
Thank you very much, Adam, for this very, very graphic and clear explanation of what kind of work you're doing on these